All right, we're going to continue on with our study. We've kind of been marching through the Bible. Again, no particular place really we're headed except for coming into the New Testament. I think if I don't change my mind or somebody doesn't ask for something differently, we're going to be looking at the divided kingdom of Israel, the united and then divided kingdom of Israel, and how the northern kingdom was carried away into captivity. And then from that, hopefully next week, we may look at a little bit of the prophets and where they were at in timing of all these things. And then from that, maybe do a little history of the time between the testaments, or the intertestament period, the 400 silent years. We'll be looking at some of that, and then we'll kind of do an introduction into the New Testament, and then maybe do some teachings and sayings of Christ, the parables. That's kind of the direction I want to go in. As always, if you have a question or something you want to study besides that, let me know. But that kind of seems to be the direction in which the study is heading for us. So what we're going to be looking at today, again, continuing on last week, or week before last, we spoke about the children of Israel. They were going to enter into the promised land. They had to follow God. We understand that there were certain things, if they didn't do, these things were going to happen. And as always, if you want some of these PowerPoint slides, if you'll give me your email address, I'll be happy to email them, or I'll put them on a flash drive for you. You can have all of this stuff if you want it. Anything that I have as far as a chart, if you see one or something you want, just feel free to email or ask me and I'll email it to you. But what we're going to be looking at is the kingdom of Israel, right? So they were in the land, they've gone into the land of Canaan, so we've kind of fast forwarded, we've skipped over the book of Judges. We understand that they went through that, they conquered the land, they fell away, God would send a judge, come back, they would fall away, and this cycle would continue through the book of Judges. But what we're going to be looking at again is this idea than the passages between 1 Samuel and 2 Kings. Now, 1 and 2 Chronicles will be kind of paralleling these books. So if you're reading through your Bible and you start hearing the same stuff again, right? Chronicles kind of puts it in a little different format than 1 Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. But that's where we're going to be looking at today. So let's dive into this. First king we're going to look at now. This is the united kingdom of Israel. So what we're going to find is Saul being made king. So you can go there, looking there in 1 Samuel chapter 9. What we're going to be just, again, flipping through this, noticing the key points that are going to be taking place. And we find that the children of Israel, when you look back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, looking there in verses 5 through 9, the children of Israel come to Samuel in verse 5, and they said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. So this is what Israel wants. They say, we want to be like the world, right? We see that today so many times. Find that, unfortunately, with the church. They say, well, do what God commands you to do. Well, we want to be like the world. We want instruments and music up here. We want the big shows. We want the entertainment. Let's be like the world. So that's essentially what Israel's asking for right now. And again, this is a united Israel. So just keep that. We're going to look at it where it divides here in a moment. This is a united Israel. They said, make us a king. We want to be a king like the rest. We want to have a king like the rest of the nations. So what we find is that Saul is chosen. He is picked as king. He is going to be the man that is going to lead them. And you can follow through in your personal study, chapter 9 going through chapter 10. And following through that Samuel, or the Saul, and the different things that were happening with that account. But when we get to 1 Samuel chapter 15, we find that Saul is not going to always follow God. He's going to disobey God. So we found that he was going to go in, Amalek, he was supposed to go in and destroy all of those people, all of that place. And Saul gathers the king and the best of the flock, and he thinks he's doing what God wants him to do, right? Again, the application for us today, we find individuals worshiping God, and they're saying, well, God, I know the Bible says to do this, but, I think God would rather like it if I did this. I think God, I know He says we can't use instrumental music in worship, but I like the way it sounds. If I can sing louder if I've got instrumental music, I think God would like that better. Notice in verse 22 of 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel said, this is after he comes, he says, I followed all the commandments of the Lord. And, he's like, well, why do I hear sheep bleating then? If you've destroyed everything, why do I hear these oxen lowing and the sheep bleating? Notice verse 22, and Samuel said, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. That's a wonderful passage. That's one you should highlight and underline in your Bible. That God wants obedience. He doesn't care about your singing, right? Your praise this morning. Oh, it's with an instrumental music, right? God doesn't like that. He wants you to obey. He said, I'm not delighting in these things. I'm delighting in obedience. So this morning we sang a cappella, and love those songs John picked out. Our God, He is alive. It's a beautiful song. We think, yeah, it sounded good to God, right? Because it's obeying Him. So again, we remember that. But Saul disobeys. And because of that, when we look in verse 23, that he is going to reject him as being king. There in verse 28, and Samuel said unto him, the Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine, that is better than thou. So Saul, sorry, you were the king, you were the first chosen king of Israel, but you would not obey. You wouldn't obey me, so I'm going to take your kingdom away. Now it's still going to be united, and here we find in 1 Samuel chapter 16, 11 through 13, the account of Samuel going and finding David. That, again, in verse 7 is a good one, that he looketh on the inward part of man. He doesn't look on the outside, right? The sons of Jesse come up, and they're big, strong, strapping men, and he's like, no, this has got to be the king. God says, no, I look at the heart. I'm looking at the heart. So we find David is chosen. So we have Saul first. He's the first king. Then you have David coming in behind him. Now at the end of 1 Samuel, chapter 31, we have the death of Saul, and you can go back and read that. That's an interesting passage. Leading up to that, we have the witch of Endor, calling up Samuel. An interesting passage there as well, that he tells Saul, you're going to be with me, you and your sons are going to be with me tomorrow. Essentially, you're going to die tomorrow, Saul. So we find him, that fulfillment of that happening in chapter 31. So there's the first king of Israel there in 1 Samuel. That says, all right, Saul is out of the way. Now, he's going to reign for 40 years. You can see that recorded in Acts chapter 13, verse 21. 40-year reign of King Saul. Now, the next man we'll have, again, obviously, is David. So we saw him going back into 1 Samuel chapter 16, 10 through 13, that he was going to be chosen. Now, after the death of Saul, what you have in 2 Samuel is a fight for the throne. So again, you have this, right? If you have a king, someone's looking for the power, someone's looking to be the next man in charge. So we have a man named Ishbosheth. So this is a man, he's going to be Saul's son. He's all right, we're going to put you in charge of Israel. We're going to make you king in that way. Abner is going to put him up in that position. If my mind serves me right there on that. Abner, he's kind of the commander of the army. He said, I'm going to put you up, you're going to be the king. Well, what I find is David is chosen as king. So what's interesting here in 2 Samuel chapter 2, looking there in verses 8 and 9, and he said unto me, who art thou? And I answered him, I am an Amalek. And he said unto me, I think I may have, that's chapter 2. That's a good verse, but not the one we need. Chapter 2, verse 8. But Abner, son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, and over the Asherites, and over Jezreel, and over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, and over all Israel. Now notice in verse 10, at the close of that, it says, but the house of Judah followed David. So this is important. This is going to continue through. That Judah is going to reject Ishbosheth as the king, and they said, no, we're following David. We're going to follow the house of David. But they're not. This is not when they're divided. So what we find is in 2 Samuel chapter 5, after Abner gets accused of kind of trying to take over the kingdom from Ishbosheth, we find in 2 Samuel chapter 5, 1 through 3, that all of Israel now is united under King David. So that's important. Verse 4 of chapter 5, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. So if you look at verse 5, in Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over Israel and Judah. So again, the combined time. But he reigns for 40 years, part of that in Judah, part of that over all of Israel. So again, the kings going through, you've got Saul, you've got David, now we have Solomon. So, son of David and Bathsheba. And yes, that's the same Bathsheba that he committed adultery with, Uriah's wife, had the child dies, and he has Bathsheba, and they have a son. You can go to 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 24, and see that account that he goes in to comfort her, and she has a son. And notice there, and David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and went in unto her and lay with her, and she bare a son, and he called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him. So what we have here is now the next king in line. Now, again, if you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, all of that history, the Hebrew history, that there's other men pining for that position. Again, that happens with everything. They're looking for that power. They're looking for that. But Solomon is going to be that king. Now, when we go to 1 Kings, flipping over, there to 1 Kings chapter 1, we find that Solomon is going to be appointed as the king. They're going to make a coup. They're trying to set this up. But it says there in verse 31 of 1 Kings chapter 1, then Bathsheba bowed with her face to the earth and did reverence to the king and said, let the Lord my King David live forever. And he's talking about coming in there to, or again, verse 30. And he's saying, Solomon, sorry, I jumped ahead there. Even as I swear, verse 30, unto thee by the Lord God of Israel, saying, assuredly Solomon thy son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne in my stead. Even so will I certainly do this day. So again, Bathsheba is petitioning this to David there in verse 31. And then we find there Nathan coming in, verse 32, and confirming these things. So Solomon is going to be set up as king. Now, 1 Kings chapter 3, notice with me there, when we talk about King Solomon, we talk about his wisdom. When he wrote, again, I want to think that Proverbs was his time as king, that maybe the Song of Solomon was written early in his life before he had the 700 wives and the 300 concubines. He has this one, and we understand the comparison between Jesus and the church there in Song of Solomon. But nonetheless, Song of Solomon being first, then Proverbs, these are sayings he made as king, and then Ecclesiastes, hopefully, when he got his life back together for the Lord. But what we'll find, though, is that God asks him in chapter 3, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5, in Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God asked, what shall I give thee? What a question. God says, what should I give you, right? You're going to be king. What should I give you? And we read through that, going on through verse 14, that Solomon says, instead of wanting the death of his enemies or wanting riches or power, he says, give me an understanding mind. I want to be able to rule your people well. And God is so pleased with him. There in verse 9, he's saying that I may discern between good and bad, for who is able to judge this thy so great a people. So it pleases God. He says, all right, since you didn't ask for any of this other stuff, you just asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you all the other stuff as well. To boot, we might say here in the South. So I'm going to give that to you. So he gives him wisdom, riches, and power, and all of these things. And we find Solomon doing very well in the kingdom. Now, on the screen, what we have here is a map, and this will kind of help you to see the area in red. That's going to be Saul's kingdom. So that's the initial kingdom, Jerusalem, right there by the Dead Sea. Always remember to go to the top of the Dead Sea, go left. Jerusalem is right there. And then David in blue, he's going to expand that kingdom quite a bit. He's going to really stretch the borders. And then we have Solomon. He's going to be the man that's going to take this territory up here at the top. So quite a bit of land is going to be in this land. We're going to be controlled by this united kingdom in Israel. Now, another thing that Solomon does is he's going to build the temple. We find it there in 1 Kings chapter 6. As he became king, he is going to build the temple. Now, here's an illustration of this, and I want you to make note, especially on the inside of the temple, it looks like it's gold because that's what it was. It was overlaid all with gold. In 1 Kings chapter 6, looking at verse 21, so Solomon overlaid the house within with pure gold, and he made a partition by the chains of gold before the oracle, and he overlaid it with gold. So verse 22, in the whole house he overlaid with gold, until he had finished all the house. Also the whole altar that was by the oracle was overlaid with gold. So when you read that account in 1 Kings chapter 6, Solomon's like, hey, we've got plenty of gold. We're just going to overlay everything. Everything was overlaid with gold. And that's going to be important here in a minute as we continue studying. So what a fantastic temple this must have been to go in and enter in. The floor, the wall, the ceiling, everything's gold. Now, Unfortunately for Solomon, his wives are going to turn him from the Lord. 1 Kings chapter 11, 1 through 4, we find that he had the 700 wives, the 300 concubines. The concubines meaning that these were marriages that helped him in the kingdom. They were political moves. It wasn't like a husband and wife relationship that we think about today. This was more political. Now, let's go to 1 Kings chapter 11. So this is where we're going to really get into, again, laying that groundwork. But here's where we want to get to. The children of Israel, they've gone into the land of Canaan, right? To the land of promise. And here they are. But they've turned from God. Now they say, give us a king. We don't want you anymore, God. We want a king. Now, look at chapter 11, 1 Kings. The beginning there in verse 11. Now, wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, for as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. So here's Solomon. He's turned his heart away from God. He says, the kingdom's gone. You're not going to have it anymore. He keeps it for David's sake, verse 12. But notice, verse 13, howbeit I will not rend away all of the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son for David my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. So this is important. He's going to divide the kingdom, but again, the promise going back all the way back to Abraham, that through thy seed all nations will be blessed. You have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob, when he is blessing the children, he says in Genesis 49 and verse 10, he says, out of the tribe of Judah, right? The scepter shall not depart from Judah. So Judah has to be important in bringing the Messiah. So we have to keep this remnant going. So he says, all right, for David's sake, right? When you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 7, he says, I'm going to establish your offspring, David. The kingdom's going to be established forever. I've got to do this for David's sake. But what we find, again, that 2 Samuel 7, a reference there, 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 13, the idea that it's going to be divided. Now, let's look here and notice... all right, let me get this, and then I'm trying to jump ahead of myself. All right, so Solomon's told you're going to have your kingdom divided. Now, let's look at this. Now, this is confusing. If you weren't confused already, you're about to get that way. Jeroboam. There's two men that we need to be really keep in mind: Jeroboam and Rehoboam. They sound very similar. Jeroboam, Rehoboam. This is important for the Bible student. When you're reading, Brittany and I were talking about that this morning. When you're reading the prophecies, right? When you go through Isaiah all the way to Malachi, when you're reading about the prophecies, so many people want to point these passages to something that's happening now or even in the future. But the prophecies were happening for the time here in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That this was happening now. That when the kingdom's about to be divided, Isaiah's prophesying all that stuff. None of that stuff is applying to us today, save the messianic prophecies. But we understand that was fulfilled when Christ came to this earth. And so it's still not pointing to any futuristic type events. So let's notice here, Jeroboam. Verse 26, we find who this individual is. He's the son, so he's not Solomon's son. Jeroboam is not Solomon's son. He is the son of Nebat, an Ephraite of Zeradah, Solomon's servant. So this is not in the king's lineage, Jeroboam. But notice there when we look in verse 29 of 1 Kings 11. It says, and it came to pass at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him in the way, and he had clad himself with a new garment, and they two were alone in the field. And Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him and rent in 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and give 10 tribes to thee. Now notice verse 32, but he shall have one tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, and the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. So, we have the kingdom going to be divided. Jeroboam is going to get 10 tribes, and then the king that's going to come from Solomon's line, he's going to have one tribe, or essentially two. Benjamin's going to be dissolved into this. So again, here's the division. It begins with Jeroboam. Now here's Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam, again, this is Solomon's son. Now, when we go to Rehoboam and you're reading there, he's going to become king, and all Israel's going to go to him, and they're going to say, hey, be a little more lenient on us instead of doing these things. What we find is the older men say, yeah, back up off of them a little bit, and they'll serve you and do good work for you. He says, and the younger counsel tells him, his younger friends say, no. He says, you tell him, the power of my father is not even in my little fingers, what he goes on to say. So he says, you think it was bad with my father? It's going to be worse with me. So what we find is that Israel departs. So look at verse 16. It says, so when all Israel saw that the king hearkened not unto them, the people answered the king, saying, what portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To our tents, O Israel. Now see that thine own house, David. So Israel departed unto their tents. Now, and as for the children of Israel, which dwelt in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. So this is important. Here's the divided kingdom. You have Israel, and Jeroboam is going to be ruling over them. You have Rehoboam, he's going to be ruling over Judah. Now, that's confusing, but what we need to look at, again, make the point that this is where the kingdom divides. So now you'll hear the king of Judah. What does that mean? It's the southern kingdom. You'll hear the northern kingdom. What does that mean? That means Israel. So we have to understand what we're talking about. And again, it helps tremendously if you're a Bible student trying to study and try to go through these things. When you hear, well, I heard Judah one time, I hear Israel one time. Who are we talking about? This is what we're getting at. The kingdom is divided. So Jeroboam, he's to the north. He says, all right, he's going to build Shechem in Mount Ephraim. And Jeroboam, this is important, in 1 Kings chapter 12, he says, if I let the people go back to Jerusalem, right, they're going to go back and turn to God. I've got to keep them from doing this. So what we find is he builds these idols in Dan and Bethel. He says, if I let them go back to Jerusalem, or again, the Jews were supposed to go back, the Israelites were supposed to go back to the feasts there at Jerusalem with the temple. He says, if they go back, they'll turn away from me and kill me. So what do I have to do? Now here's a map as well. You find the northern kingdoms up here. Now again, we look back at the map where they had the kingdom laid out. So Jerusalem again right here, right off the Dead Sea. So all of this is Judah. So when you look at this, again, when you read the prophecies concerning Judah, here's what we're talking about. When you read the prophecies concerning Israel, the northern kingdom, Dan at the uppermost point, Bethel at the southernmost point. So what it is he's saying, all right, don't go back to Jerusalem. I'm the king. You can worship the calves here and Dan and Bethel, and that's just as good. So what we find that through this divided kingdom now is that you're going to have a lot of bad kings in Israel. Now I know that's probably hard for you to read, and if you want to take a picture of it, that's fine, or if you want to ask me later for it, I can send it to you, or probably just look it up online. But essentially you have the northern kingdom, and all of these kings are bad. You got extra bad, worst of all, that's for Ahab. Mostly bad, Jehu, all those guys, very bad kings. So no good king in the northern kingdom. Now after that, you have the southern king. Now you'll notice of the southern kingdom, you have some that are good, Asa, Jehoshaphat. You got Josiah down here, Hezekiah, the man we talked about today, Hezekiah, number 13 there, among the best. Manasseh, his son, among the worst. Josiah, you hear about him. Being young and taking the throne there at a young age. But these are the kings of the southern kingdom. So when you're talking about this, when you're reading about these men, understand that they're not the whole entirety of Israel. Israel is no more at this time. When you talk about Israel, you're talking about the northern kingdom, right? You're talking about the 10 tribes, northern tribes. That's Israel when you begin to study the Kings and the Chronicles. Now, let's look at this. Omri, or Omri, however you want to pronounce that, reigns over Israel, again, the northern kingdom, and he builds Samaria. So this is important. 1 Kings chapter 16, looking there, he's going to build a place called Samaria. Now that, again, to the Bible student, we're looking at, oh yeah, I've heard of Samaria. But notice there when we go in that Shalmaneser. Now again, this is not Sennacherib. This is Shalmaneser, again an Assyrian. He's going to carry away Israel out of Samaria and Israel out of that place. So 2 Kings 17, that's pretty much what we're talking about. Now why is that important? Because they're going to deport people. We're going to see that again here in just a minute. the Assyrians carry away the captives of Israel, and they deport them into Babylon and all these other places. And then they bring people from these places and bring them into Samaria, into Israel. Now, why is that important for us today? Again, here's the deportation. Look there in verse 17, chapter 24. And the woman, 2 Kings. I'm sorry, I'm in 1 Kings. 2 Kings 17. This is great. 24. Notice, and the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and from Sepharvaim and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. Now, why is that important? What does that even have to do with anything? When we go to the New Testament now, right, who do we hear about? The Samaritans. You hear about the Samaritan woman. You hear about the Good Samaritan. We hear about the Jews walking around Samaria. Why? Why did they despise the Samaritans? Why did they count them as dogs? Because they weren't true Israelites. They were no longer pure-blooded Israelites. They had been mixed in, they had intermarried, they had been going after this stuff. So what you have is these nations all around, and they're worshiping their gods, they're bringing their gods with them. So what we find is this is why the Jews hated the Samaritans so much, is because they weren't pure-blooded, if we would say that word, pure-blooded Jews. So they really despise them, they really hate them, and they don't want anything to do with them there while they do that. So here's what we have. Right? The Assyrians, they came in, they took them, and they're going to leave with them. Now, what's interesting, and let me make this note and we're going to proceed on because we're running out of time. Hezekiah, we talked about him this morning in the worship hour. Initially, he paid for them to leave him alone. So if you go to 2 Kings chapter 18, looking there where we're at this morning, looking there in verse 14 at the tail end, he says he told Hezekiah to give him 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Notice in verse 15, and Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord, in the treasures of the king's house. At that time did Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord, and from the pillars which Hezekiah king of Judah had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So that picture we looked at a few slides back, the temple overlaid with gold. Hezekiah's like, I got to pay this tribute to the king. He pulls all that gold down in order to give it to him. Now, real quickly, and we're here at the close. You probably can't see that as good. I didn't get a good, I tried to find one a little bit better, but I really couldn't, the way it laid out the way I want. But next week we'll try to look at this. But what's important is this first line coming off, you've got the three kings. You've got the three kings up here, the United Kingdom, and then the division, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, Israel up here. But what you want to look at is Obadiah. When you read the book of Obadiah, that's what we're talking about. Jonah, Amos, Hosea. All of these men were prophesying at this time. So it's important. Don't look at that and say, oh, that must be in 2024. No. That was all talking about all of this, trapped to the coming destruction of the Assyrian captivity. That's all they're pointing toward, is the destruction, not the destruction for America, the destruction of Israel. So we find them here. Now, Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, they're all in Babylonian captivity, right? Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, all of these prophets are for Judah. So when, again, the southern kingdoms, they're all talking about the coming destruction of Babylon, and then Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Habakkuk, they're all in Babylonian captivity, and Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are talking after that. So I heard this morning in class, y'all are studying about Ezra, Nehemiah. They came back out of Babylonian captivity. That's what we're talking about. I was talking to Brittany this morning. If you look in your Bibles at some time, when you look at Nehemiah, from Genesis to Nehemiah, that's it. That's Hebrew history, all this section. It's the beginning, God creating the world, Abraham, the promise, the children of Israel going down into Egypt, right? Going into Canaan, going down into Egypt, coming back out, the divided kingdom, they get carried away into captivity, and they come back. That's it. Hebrew history right there. Then you have the Psalms and the Proverbs, the literature, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Then you have Isaiah through Malachi, and all of that, the prophecy, is talking about this. It's all talking about the stuff that was happening in Hebrew history. So if we look at that, we won't be looking and saying, oh, I'm reading in this book, and it's talking about all of these signs we need to be looking at. No, friends, that was talking about the coming destruction of Israel by Assyria, and then Babylon through there, talking about for Judah. So when you go to the end of 2 Kings, noticing there that's how it closes out, that Babylon's going to come, and they're going to destroy them there. You can look in chapter 25, and it came to pass in the 9th year of the reign, 10th month of the 10th day, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his host, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and they built forts against it round about. So you can read that on your own time. So what we find is that Assyria carries away Israel, and then Babylon carries away Judah. So here's some quick slides, some pictures here that we can look at. Now what we were talking about this morning, and I'll go through these quickly, but this is a relief. What would happen is when a king, he went to the Assyrian king, and he's going to pay that gold, he's going to pay those treasures. He looks on the wall of his palace, and he sees these descriptions, these images subscribed on there, and he says, oh, this is what the Assyrians are going to do. Now, what we're talking about, I think you can see it pretty well. That's a pole that these men are grabbing a hold of, and that's a man on top of it, right? He's pierced through with that. That's impalement. The Assyrians impaled their victims. So again, what we were talking about this morning in the worship hour, they weren't just coming to cut your head off. They were coming to impale you. So they started doing that. When you die, they would impale you and put you up. Then they got to where they would impale you alive in gravity, dragging your body down that pole and killing you slowly. This is the beginnings of crucifixion. When you see these men on these poles, they would suffer on that, and they found that if they tie them up there, instead of letting gravity do that, I said, we can stretch this out a little farther. So the Assyrians begin the idea of crucifixion. That's where we get that, and again, in going into Rome in that time. So these images would be on the king's palace when you walked in, and you're like, oh man, I better pay tribute to this guy, or that's going to be me hanging on the pole. Now, not only that, I don't know if you can probably not see that very good. I tried to highlight this. Probably not that good either. Anyway, you can kind of see there's a tower right here, a man shooting a bow. Here's the ramparts driving up to conquer this. And again, that's what they're depicting when you come in. You can't fight against me, because this is what we do to individuals. This is what we come up against. Now, quickly here. This is, you can tell, probably, there's a man, looks like he's bowed down before this king. This is Jehu. So you read about him in the Bible, King Jehu, I think he's the northern king, the northern tribe. But anyway, he's bowing down here to the king, saying, all right, I'm going to pay. This is Shalmaneser. And this is interesting because, again, for the skeptic of the Bible, we have a character in the Bible mentioned, Jehu, giving tribute to a Syrian king. And that's on this black obelisk, is what this is called, a black obelisk. And you can see, kind of hopefully, these depictions, and what that is when they would bring them certain things. Here you have people bringing them camels, the tribute. This was brought to them, so this is what they're showing off. It's a trophy, essentially. It says, I have destroyed Samaria, right? I've destroyed Jerusalem. Here's all the things that I've taken away from it. So up at the top you can see Jehu up there again, bowing down to the Syrian king. And you have the camels there, part of this tribute. Now this isn't too far off. We see this as well. This is the Arch of Titus in Jerusalem, or in Rome, excuse me. It's where they sacked Jerusalem. So you have the Ark of Titus there. And it's interesting because Titus is the man that overthrew Jerusalem. And you can see right there, see that candlestick? The menorah is what the Jews would call it today. You see them? Those are the Roman army carrying everything out of the temple when they destroyed it. So what we're looking at, friends, that's biblical history. We can see today the events that were happening. So this is not uncommon. So this is so important, again, where we're at. We'll talk about the prophets a little bit next week, Lord willing. And what we're seeing is this great division. The kingdoms are divided. They go off into captivity. And then as you're studying on Sunday morning, they come back. They rebuild the temple. So Solomon's temple is destroyed. They rebuild another one. The Romans destroy it in AD 70 for good. So we'll kind of get into that and get into a little bit more of the history. So I've gone a minute or two past. Is there any questions or comments about some of that we talked about there today?